A rich man paid me to date him for 7 days. What happened next? Shocked me. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Truth Untold Story. Which country are you watching this video from? If you're new to the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell for more emotional stories every day. It had been another long night. The restaurant was loud, the tips were short, and Sophie's feet ached from 10 hours of standing. She pushed open the door to her tiny studio apartment, tossed her apron on the couch, and sighed. The city outside buzzed with life, but inside her world, everything felt still and tired. She microwaved leftover noodles, pulled off her shoes, and opened her laptop. The screen lit her face in the dim room, casting shadows that made her look older than 24. She had 3 unread emails, one from a discount clothing site, one from her mother asking for money again, and the third, strange. The subject line was simple. Private arrangement, urgent inquiry. Curious, she clicked. I need someone to accompany me for 7 days, no intimacy required, strictly companionship. $20,000. Interested? Sophie blinked. Once, twice. There was an attachment, a photograph. She clicked it open and saw the face of a man in his early 30s. Dark hair, neatly styled, a sharp jawline, unreadable eyes, and a suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He looked like someone out of a movie, too put together, too serious, too rich. She laughed out loud. Yeah, okay. What is this? Some kind of scam, she muttered. But the email wasn't asking for her bank details, no suspicious links, just that strange, vague proposition. Sophie read it again. 7 days. No intimacy. $20,000. It didn't make sense. She leaned back, running a hand through her tangled hair. Her mind wandered to the eviction notice taped to her fridge. She had 2 weeks to find $1,800 or she'd be out on the street. No friends to stay with, no family who could help, just a job that barely kept her afloat and dreams that had long been shelved. She clicked on the sender's profile. An encrypted business email, no real info, just the initials, EC. Was it dangerous? Probably. Was it real? Maybe. Was she desperate? Absolutely. She closed her eyes and tried to reason with herself. What kind of man offers 20 grand for company? What did companionship even mean in this context? But the email's tone wasn't sleazy. It was oddly formal, businesslike, like it was written by someone who didn't want love or lust, just presence. She stood up, pacing the room now, adrenaline rising. I'm not that kind of girl, she whispered to herself, though no one was there to hear it. But this wasn't about that, not really. This was about a choice, about survival. She thought about all the things she could do with that kind of money, pay off her student debt, fix the broken heater, maybe even start that where and when. She didn't reread it, didn't wait, just hit send and closed the laptop. The room was quiet again, but her mind was anything but. Something had shifted. The reply came less than 6 hours later. A brief message, a location, a time, a car would be waiting. Sophie barely slept that night. By morning, her nerves were a wildfire beneath her skin. She packed a small overnight bag, unsure what to bring when dressing for an unknown life. She wore a simple black dress, heels too high for comfort, and tucked her trembling hands into her coat pockets. At precisely noon, a sleek black car pulled up in front of her building. The driver, an older man in a crisp uniform, stepped out and opened the door without a word. The silence unnerved her. As the cityscape gave way to quiet roads and trees, Sophie's mind played games. What if this was a trap? What if no one knew where she was going? She gripped the strap of her purse a little tighter, but soon the car turned into a long stone driveway. At the end of it stood a massive estate, modern, minimalist, and colder than any place she'd ever seen. The front door opened before the car fully stopped. He stood there, Ethan Cole. He was taller than she expected, broader. His presence filled the entrance like a shadow stretching across a polished floor. He didn't smile, but he didn't look unkind either. Just detached. "Miss Harper," he said, voice low and smooth. She nodded. He extended a hand, and she took it. His skin was warm, but his grip was measured, like everything about him. "Welcome." Inside, the estate was a sculpture of marble, steel, and silence. Floors that echoed, art that was beautiful but impersonal, not a photo in sight, not a wrinkle in the furniture. They sat across from each other in a sun-drenched sitting room, the silence between them almost ceremonial. He slid a folded contract across the coffee table. 7 days, one event per evening, galas, dinners, networking parties. She would pose as his date, no strings, no personal questions, no intimacy, just presence. In return, $20,000, cash, paid in full on the final day. Sophie read every word twice, though her hands shook. Then she signed. Ethan didn't thank her. He simply nodded, then stood. "First event is tonight. You'll find a selection of dresses upstairs. Wear whichever you prefer." He turned and walked away. She sat there for a moment longer, unsure if she had just sold her freedom or stepped into something she couldn't yet name. Upstairs, she found a wardrobe that looked like it belonged to a movie star, gowns in silk. He said nothing when he saw her, just gave a subtle nod of approval. In the car on the way to the event, the silence between them returned. Sophie glanced at him once. He was staring out the window, jaw tight, mind elsewhere. She wanted to ask him something, anything, but remembered the contract. No questions. At the venue, they stepped into the light together. Flashbulbs, voices, music. He wrapped an arm gently around her waist. Not possessive, just precise. She smiled, laughed when needed, made polite conversation with strangers she'd never see again. Ethan played his part too. Charming, smooth, yet never fully present. But behind the glances and the champagne, Sophie noticed something. His eyes never sparkled, not once. When the night ended, they returned to the estate. He opened the door for her, but didn't follow her inside. Instead, he murmured, "Good night," and disappeared into another hallway. She stood in the grand corridor, alone, the soft click of her heels echoing off marble. And for the first time she wondered, who broke him, and why did he still look at her like she might be the cure? 2 days had passed. Sophie was growing used to the rhythm. Dresses, events, polite nods, and scripted laughter. But inside, the stillness in Ethan lingered like a locked room she didn't have the key to. She watched him when he wasn't watching her, when his eyes drifted past champagne flutes and hollow conversations, when his smile faded the moment a guest turned away. By the third night, the air felt different. The charity gala was hosted at a historic museum, glass ceilings, golden light, and music echoing off marble like ghosts from another era. Sophie wore a silver gown that shimmered as she moved. Ethan stood beside her in a navy suit, crisp and quiet, his hand lightly at her back. The crowd swirled with wealth and whispers. Art collectors, board members, celebrities who pretended not to be noticed. Ethan did what he always did, smiled just enough, said little, and disappeared behind his own perfect posture. But tonight, Sophie noticed something. He was drinking. Not much, but more than usual. His jaw was tense, his replies curt. When a woman approached, tall, blonde, familiar, his shoulders stiffened. She leaned in and whispered something close to his ear. He didn't respond, just stared at her coldly until she walked away, flustered. Sophie said nothing, but she filed it away. The car ride back was silent, but heavier than before. The kind of silence that wasn't just quiet, it was full. Back at the estate, instead of disappearing down a hallway, Ethan paused. "You want a drink?" he asked, eyes. Then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "I was engaged once. Her name was Lauren." Play. The name sat in the air like a bruise. Play. "We met before I had anything. She said she loved the struggle, the ambition, said it made life interesting." He laughed bitterly. Play. "When the business tanked, she left. Took what she could, even my dog. Didn't even say goodbye. Just a note on the counter. Play. Play." Sophie didn't move, didn't interrupt. Play. "Of course, 2 years later I made everything back, and more. That's when she came back." Play. He looked up at her, and for the first time, Sophie saw pain. Real, raw, unfiltered. Play. "She said she'd made a mistake, said she missed me, but all I could see was the bank balance on her mind." Play. His voice dropped, barely a whisper. Play. "That's why I stopped trusting people. Everyone loves a man with money. No one loves the man before it." Play. Sophie sat her glass down slowly. Play. "So, why me?" she asked gently. Play. Play. Ethan didn't hesitate. Play. "Because you're not pretending to love me. I didn't hire you for affection. I hired you to remember what it feels like to be around someone who's not after me. Or my money." Play. 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 Sophie's heart ached, not out of pity but understanding. She knew the feeling of being seen as less than human. A waitress, a number, a convenience. She looked at him, really looked. Play. "Then maybe," she said quietly, "stop hiding behind your bank account." Play. Play. For a beat, he didn't react. The silence was full again, but this time it felt alive. Play. Then his mouth twitched. Not a smirk, not a performance, a smile, a real one. The kind that lifted his whole face, softened the edges, made him look younger, like a version of himself before all the damage. Play. Sophie smiled back, but said nothing more. Play. They sat in the quiet, two people who had worn masks for too long, and for the first time, both of them let one slip. Morning came slower now. Sophie no longer counted the hours. The mansion no longer felt like a set piece, cold and distant, but more like a home that had forgotten how to be warm and was slowly remembering. Play. Ethan was different too. He met her in the kitchen that morning, barefoot, wearing a plain t-shirt instead of a suit. He offered her coffee, freshly made, and when she smiled, he smiled back without thinking. Play. They had no event that night, no reason to perform. Instead, they lingered over breakfast. She told him about growing up in a tiny apartment with a mother who worked 3 jobs, how she used to write poems on napkins in the diner where her mum waited tables. He listened. She stalled twice, panicked once, and then finally, she did it. She drove. They drove for hours down winding roads, windows down, wind in their hair, music playing from an old radio station. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. When the sun set, they sat on the hood of the car parked in a quiet meadow. She pulled out a crumpled journal from her bag. "You really want to hear one?" she asked, a little shy. He didn't answer, just nodded, eyes soft. Sophie read aloud. The poem was about silence, about wanting to be seen without having to shout. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Real, bare, unfiltered. When she finished, Ethan didn't speak for a while. Finally, he said, "I never knew words could feel like that." She looked at him, surprised. He wasn't pretending. Back at the estate, they didn't part ways like they usually did. Instead, they sat outside beneath a patio heater, wrapped in blankets, sipping red wine. The stars stretched overhead in endless quiet. She caught him watching her, not just glancing, but seeing her. And she saw him too, not the billionaire or the businessman, but the man who had learned to armor his heart and was slowly letting go. They didn't talk about the contract, or the money, or the looming end. They talked about the little things, her favorite songs, his favorite tree as a boy, the first time he broke a bone, her dream of owning a bookstore. Time bent around them. Eventually, the silence turned to whispers. He leaned in close, as if afraid of his own words. "I wish it wasn't just 7 days." Pagination, her breath caught. She didn't know what to say, but she didn't need to. Their eyes met. His were no longer guarded, hers no longer afraid. For a heartbeat, the world felt suspended, like a held breath waiting to exhale. And in that shared stillness, something unspoken bloomed. Not loud, not rushed, just real. The morning was too quiet. Even the birds outside seemed hesitant, as if they knew what the day meant. Sophie stood by the window of her guest room, still wrapped in the blanket from last night. The stars were gone. The wine glasses from the patio sat untouched on a tray, forgotten in their haze of closeness. But now, it was day 7, the final day. Downstairs, the sound of cutlery echoed faintly. Ethan was already at the breakfast table, coffee in hand, posture straighter than usual, guarded again, distant. Sophie entered without a word. They sat opposite each other, toast going cold between them, coffee untouched. Neither of them spoke. Time moved slowly, like it was trying. He looked at her, confused. Her eyes met his, steady but soft. "You didn't buy me, Ethan. You found me." His face broke in the smallest way, just the flicker of something unraveling beneath the surface. "Sophie," his voice cracked, "don't leave." Her throat tightened. She could feel the tears pressing at the corners of her eyes, but she held them back, not out of pride, just grace. "You didn't hire me to stay," she said gently. "You hired me to remind you that you still feel." She reached for his hand. "And now, you do." He closed his eyes, just for a second, long enough to gather the breath he couldn't quite catch. She stood. He didn't move. She picked up her small overnight bag, packed the night before, not because she wanted to leave, but because she knew she had to. He rose from his chair, but didn't speak. At the front door, she turned to look at him one last time. He stood in the hallway, still and helpless, no longer the man who once controlled every room he entered, just a man caught in a moment he never prepared for. Sophie stepped out into the morning light. The car was waiting. She walked down the stone steps slowly, unsure if he'd call her name, unsure if he'd chase after her. Part of her wanted him to, but part of her knew. If he did, it had to be real, not out of guilt, not because the contract was over, because he chose her, not the arrangement, not the need, her. As the driver loaded her bag into the trunk, she glanced back one final time. The door remained open. Ethan stood there, unmoving. Their eyes met across the distance. No words, Just a goodbye, thick with everything left unsaid. And then she turned away. Not because she wanted to, but because sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do. The city felt colder than usual that week. Sophie's tiny apartment smelled like stale coffee and old books, the worn couch sagging beneath her tired frame. Another long shift at the diner had drained her, body aching, spirit bruised. She tried to tell herself it was over, that the man who had swept into her life like a storm was now just a memory, a lesson, a story to be told. But deep down, her heart whispered otherwise. She hadn't heard from Ethan since the morning she left. Days passed. The emptiness inside her grew heavier. Was it foolish to hope, to expect a call, a message, a sign that maybe, just maybe, what they shared wasn't fleeting? On the 7th day after their goodbye, as twilight painted the sky in hues of pink and orange, there was a soft, hesitant knock at her door. Her breath hitched.
I realized something,
He said, voice trembling as if the words were heavy stones he'd been carrying alone. You didn't just remind me how to feel. He paused. You made me fall in love. Sophie blinked, tears springing unbidden to the corners of her eyes. The ache inside her chest softened, blooming with hope. She whispered, almost breathless, I was waiting for you. Ethan stepped forward slowly, closing the gap that had stretched between them like a chasm. The door clicked softly behind them, sealing out the cold world and holding only the warmth of two hearts finding their way. He opened her poetry notebook and read aloud one of her poems, the one about silence and being seen. His voice cracked on a few lines and Sophie smiled through tears. They sat on her worn couch, the rose resting on the small coffee table, forgotten for the moment. No grand gestures, no promises, just two people, finally honest. Ethan reached out and took her hand. Will you stay? He asked. Sophie squeezed his hand. I don't want this to end, she said. He nodded. I don't want it to either. Days turned into weeks, their worlds intertwined slowly, careful, tender. Ethan showed her the man beneath the money and power. Sophie showed him how to live outside the walls he'd built. She taught him patience. He taught her to dream bigger. Together, they laughed at their mistakes and celebrated their victories. He wasn't just a rich man who paid for company anymore. She wasn't just a girl hired for 7 days. They became something real, something worth fighting for. And on a quiet night, beneath a sky dusted with stars, Ethan whispered again. Forever begins now. Sophie smiled, because for the first time, forever didn't feel like a promise or a threat. It felt like home.